Good morning, everybody, and welcome at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. We are here at the AMSIP, Amsterdam International Business School, and at the Center for Economic Transformation. So in this university, we do a lot of research and teaching on new economics, and we put a high value on sustainable urban development, sustainable economic development. That's really important, and we want to include that also in the teaching, and we do research in that field. And personally, I work here as a professor of urban innovation, and this summer I read a quite intriguing book written by Paula Di Perna, and it's called Pricing the Priceless. I like that title. This book was about nature. How do we price nature? How do we value nature? And the idea is that nature is giving us a lot. It gives us our existence, actually. And our economy, in a way, also depends completely on nature. Without nature, we wouldn't have an economy at all, and we wouldn't exist either. So what Paula Di Perna said in her book, she just gives a lot of examples what's going wrong when we do not value nature and how this is really destroying our planet. And currently, the way we have our economy organized is actually ruining our planet. And in this book, she mentions a lot of financial innovations that try to redress this problem, that try to fix it. And pricing the priceless suggests that we should put a price on nature, because now we can use anything from nature, but nature never sends us a bill. And when you don't receive a bill, but you receive a lot from something, maybe you take too much. So that's the problem. And in that book, you were mentioned, Delton Chen, Dr. Chen, who is our speaker today. And I'm really so happy that you are here. Somehow we met on LinkedIn and you were around in London and you said, maybe we can find a way to come over and have a lecture here on your idea on how to finance the climate problem, how to address the problem. And your lecture will be on redefining climate economics with a carbon currency. And this carbon currency, well, it was described in the book of Paula Di Perna, and I was really intrigued by it. I'm not a monetary economist, but I know something about that. And it immediately grabbed my imagination. So I'm really happy that you are here to explain to us what is a carbon currency, how could it help to address the current climate crisis that we are in the middle of? And so I would like to give you the floor and explain it, because you can do it a lot better than I can. And Mr. Chen will speak for about 30-40 minutes, and after that we will have a Q&A. And if there are more questions, I guess we stay around a bit so we can meet each other. So the floor is yours, Delton. And very much welcome here.
Thank you, Willem.
Mike.
Well, good morning again. As Willem said, I'm not from here, I'm from Australia. By way of background, I'm actually an engineer. And I've been studying this problem of climate change policy and economics for about 9 years. This is a project I founded in 2014. Actual fact, one of the co-founders is Joel van der Beek, who's Dutch and lives and works in the Netherlands. He's an economist. This presentation has a lot of slides, so I'll just give you an overview of what you're going to get. We're going to look quickly an introduction to the book and the policy, the climate problem I'll discuss, what is a carbon reward or carbon currency. Then I'll start to talk about theory, the expanded theory for the market failure. And then at the end, I'm going to try and answer, how can we price nature? Okay. At the end of this, you'll have sort of an overview of an alternative model for the economics of carbon and pricing nature. By coincidence, Kim Stanley Robinson, who's the author of this novel, Minister of the Future, was actually in Amsterdam, apparently just a couple of weeks ago, or recently, 2 weeks ago. I think there was a translation of his book. So Kim Stanley Robinson, he saw my work and he incorporated it into his novel. So if you do read the book, it talks about the near-term future of climate disruption and a possible resolution based on what he calls carbon coin. In fact, he refers to the developer as Dr. Chen, which is myself, which is really great. And he didn't actually contact me before he wrote the book. I just reviewed the book for him after he wrote the manuscript. And Paula DePerna was mentioned. She also talked about this policy in her recent book, Pricing the Priceless. And the actual fact, I'm taking that name to kind of inspire this conversation today. How do we price nature? Can we price nature? This is an interesting question because if you think about it from your own personal perspective, you might feel uncomfortable with the idea of pricing nature, in that what price would you put on eagles or birds? If the African elephant went extinct, what's that worth in monetary terms, or to save it? Indeed, what about whole ecosystems? What value can we put on the climate system, for example, and the ecosystems which produce the organisms from which we are derived, and so on? Could you price the moon? How much is the moon worth, if you want to go to extremes? So how do we answer this question? It's not a simple question to answer. Economists do try to answer it, of course, by using integrated assessment models when they assess the climate damages. So those models quantify impacts on people, but they're heavily criticized because of the inputs and outputs are somewhat arbitrary. Whoops, we'll come back here. So I just wanted to talk about climate change quickly to give some context. We recently had very extreme temperature records globally. For example, September was the hottest September on record, and the increase in temperature from other Septembers was also a record change, 0.5 degree Celsius. And we had an extreme hot day in the 3rd of July. It was the hottest day in over 100,000 years. So there's a combination of global warming, the El Nino effect, and the circulation of heat through the oceans and other effects which are driving these sudden changes, perhaps unexpectedly as well. In terms of global warming, the latest thinking and science behind climate change is that not only is climate change going to be non-linear, it's going to be driven by what they call tipping elements that pose a risk of shifting into a new non-linear trajectory. For example, in this diagram, these circles represent tipping elements that are already being triggered. We have Greenland ice sheet. Recent studies have found that they're melting much faster than previously thought. The British Antarctic Survey, I think it's called, did some modelling, and they believe the West Antarctic ice sheet is actually already triggered, that we can't stop it from collapsing now. That's the latest modelling. Coral reefs, they're prone to coral bleaching at higher temperatures. And so they're going to bleach probably between 1.5 and 2 degrees, but probably closer to 1.5. So that's another tipping point. And there's some others here. The northern permafrost abrupt thaw. Scientists aren't too sure what's going to happen up there. Barents Sea, that's actually warming at the fastest rate on the planet because of ice loss, sea ice loss. So there are other tipping elements too, which come later. So if we don't arrest global warming, we'll just keep triggering more of these tipping elements. There's more bad news, unfortunately. Dr. James Hansen recently published a paper where he argues that we're likely to see accelerated global warming following this trajectory instead of this trajectory. And he thinks that this is going to happen because he claims that the science community have underestimated the masking effect of aerosols. And for the past 10 years, the shipping sector and other sectors have been cleaning up their aerosol pollution, and that reduces the albedo effect related to clouds, and it's heating up the planet. So if Dr. Hansen's right, we're going to pass 1.5 degrees pretty soon, and 2 degrees possibly by mid-century, which is bad news. This chart here suggests that there might also be a new trend in methane emissions. Scientists aren't entirely sure, but more methane's coming out of wetlands as a possible feedback mechanism. So these trends, new trends, are quite alarming. Then we have planetary boundaries. You may have heard of the planetary boundaries, I'm sure you have. So the latest analysis by Rockstrom et al. Is that we may have passed 6 of these 9 boundaries. You've seen them before, so I won't spend much time on this, but I'll just make one point about these boundaries, that this one, which is climate change, it's definitely related to carbon. The carbon cycle, of course, greenhouse gases. The biosphere, well, it's comprised of carbon. All life is carbon-based. Land system change, it's to do with the hydrological cycle, climate and carbon. Freshwater change, it's also related to climate and carbon. And nitrogen and phosphorus also stoichiometrically related to carbon. So everything, most of those problems are related to the carbon cycle. Carbon offsets. We've all heard of carbon offsets, true? Yeah, carbon credits. Have you heard about the reviews of carbon offsetting and how many of them appear to be not additional or corrupted? So this is a major problem. It has the carbon market in disarray, and it reveals that there's something inherently problematic with carbon offsetting, not just the accounting and the corruption, but when you offset, you're not actually really mitigating. You're just lowering the cost of mitigation. That's the concept behind it. And so we're in this situation. We're like frogs in a pot of water with the slow boiling effect. We're trying to solve a problem. We need trillions of dollars extra targeted on mitigation, and we need stronger global governance. But the frogs are saying, well, what about carbon offsetting and green growth? That's kind of where we're at, but we need to make a change from this sort of incremental mindset. So in this section, I'm going to introduce the policy, and I'm going to focus on the financial mechanism, just to give you an overview of how it works. If you have an understanding of how it works, then it's much easier to talk about theory and philosophy to understand what this is all about. So this chart here, you may have seen charts like this before. It's a hypothetical for 1.5 degrees, where we have our historical emissions that have been rising, and ideally, we would reduce them very quickly to follow this trajectory. And then we'd have residual emissions. This is to achieve 1.5 degrees. And then we would need to remove carbon from the atmosphere because of the residual emissions, which are difficult to stop. Earlier, I said the Hansen studies indicating that the climate sensitivity is higher than previously thought, which would mean even this isn't sufficient to stay at 1.5 degrees, probably. So let's just assume it is. It implies that we would need to mitigate the blue because we're kind of heading in this direction with policies that are currently implemented. If we include all the pledges, maybe we would get down to here, but we would still need to mitigate that blue. And of course, we'd need to remove the red from the atmosphere, carbon removal. So think of it as reductions, residual, and removal. Now, in this framing, assuming the world attempts this, there are different thoughts about how much it would cost or the financing behind it. The neoclassical economic theory on taxes implies that we would need about $40 to $100 per tonne tax on the emissions to decarbonise or resolve the market failure. However, if you listen to the media around the world, taxes are very unpopular. For example, in the US and Australia, governments simply won't run on a carbon tax platform for the elections. It's just a non-starter. So it's difficult to implement. And on average, the cost of carbon is around $6 per tonne globally. So it's currently an order of magnitude too low. And the estimates are that we would need about another $3 trillion a year to decarbonise the energy sector and the economy, and roughly $1 trillion a year for this removal, assuming that we only need this much removal, which is a minimal amount. And so our policy, or this policy, the carbon reward, what it's going to do, it's going to offer carrots or rewards, financial rewards, to pay for this and to pay for this. It's complementary to the taxes. So we still can use taxes, cap and trade and regulations, everything else. It's not stopping that, it's adding to it. Think of carrots and sticks. And the policy is based on 3 rules. Rule 1 for cleaner energy, Rule 2 for cleaner businesses, and Rule 3 for carbon removal. Now, this generally is called conventional mitigation, and this is called carbon removal. The rules for 1 and 2, they're based on concept of flexible pricing and strategic planning. So there's a top-down strategic plan would be developed, and then the prices are flexible for paying for this. And then we'd have a global explicit price for this in a kind of a market approach, much more simple market approach. So that's the framework for the reward, a reward rule book, if that makes sense. The instrument is the carbon currency. So when you think of currency, you might think of money. This is actually not like euros. I'll explain in a moment, but the unit of account is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent strategically mitigated for 100 years. So it's quite similar to carbon credits, but it's not a carbon credit. XCC is the proposed code under international standards for currencies. It's analogous to precious metal currencies. So you might not know, but there are currencies traded for gold, silver, platinum, and palladium in the foreign exchange market. They're commodity currencies. Nobody uses them to buy stuff, but this currency would simply be similar to that as an analogy. It's not a medium of exchange, so nobody's going to use it to go shopping. It's purely an asset. It's not a carbon credit, and it will not be available for offsetting. So that's really important because this policy doesn't promote offsetting, and it avoids that problem because it's going to be fully funded.
What is offsetting?
Carbon offsetting is when a company, rather than reducing its emissions, it prefers to have someone else reduce their emissions somewhere else, and they pay them for that service by buying a carbon credit from them. XCC is not a security or a cryptocurrency. So if you're into finance, a security has a specific meaning. Under tax laws, it's commodity, and it's not a cryptocurrency. Now, I mentioned carbon reward, I mentioned carbon currency. What's the difference? Well, a carbon reward is simply the carbon currency, its value relative to another currency. So, for example, if I had a cup of coffee, what's the value of a cup of coffee? Well, intrinsically, you might enjoy it and you know what the value is, but in a market, you need to compare it to something. Typically here be euros, true? Similar here, we compare it to other currencies, and thus we express the carbon reward as currency pairs or exchange rates. An example would be the currency could be US dollars, euros, British pound, or Chinese yuan, and there you have it. So it's quite convenient to be able to express carbon rewards with carbon currency. Here are a few examples. Here in the European Union, if you just quote the currency pair exchange rate, you've got the perfect units. It's euros per tonne strategically mitigated, and there you have it. That's the reward. And so I'll try and demystify this. This is the financial mechanism for carbon rewards with the carbon currency as the instrument. So there are steps. What we'd have is we'd have a carbon exchange authority, a new institution set up for this policy. And this institution it's pretty much international. It will have a lot of control over the ledger for the carbon currency. And it will, with the rules, it will invite industry businesses to mitigate and earn it. Okay, so these guys here, the project investors, they would have to sign a contract called a service level agreement, and that commits them to performance and measurement, etc., over the long term. These are evergreen contracts or long-term contracts. So from the point of view of the Exchange Authority, those contracts are its assets. And then when it issues the carbon currency, that currency is its liability. It's somewhat analogous to the way commercial banks work, where they have mortgages, for example, and issue new currency. Once the project owners earn the carbon currency, at some point they will want to spend that and realize its value, maybe to pay wages or pay down debt or whatever. And to do that, they will first need to trade it for a hard currency, euros, dollars, whatever. And so they will sell the carbon currency into the foreign exchange market, where the private sector will buy the carbon currency for hard currency. I'll explain why that will happen in a moment. But if for some reason the private sector isn't buying enough carbon currency, if there's not enough demand, then the central banks will step in and they will buy the carbon currency. And the way they will do it is through a process that's similar to quantitative easing. I'll call it strategic quantitative easing. So they will digitally create euros for the European Central Bank, for example, by expanding the money supply. It's a bank reserve money, and they will buy the carbon currency from the market, and that new money will go into circulation. It'll create monetary inflation, that's true, but that's the process. So that's the financial mechanism. I'll come back to that in a minute, but these are the three rules again, and I'll just quickly go over them just to make it a bit more clear. If you're interested in the carbon markets and how all this works, there are a lot of details, so I won't go through them here, but you've got to deal with different scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and it goes on, but the idea is that Rule 1 will pay to keep fossil fuels in the ground. That's really important. So, for example, we could pay to keep oil and gas in the ground in the Amazon or the Congo Basin or wherever, and we could pay also to retire coal-fired power plants. Rule 2, we can come up with bespoke formulas to reward different sectors of the economy, different industries to decarbonise quickly. And that's very flexible, the way that these industries can be financially rewarded, because we want to achieve those price points for rapid decarbonisation. Rules 1 and 2 also have to be implemented and managed in a way that supply and demand for energy are balanced. So this is a key strategy, very high-level strategy. If we, for example, if we were to reduce the supply of fossil fuels, increasing the scarcity of fossil fuels would actually drive a higher price and more exploration. So what we do with these rules is we reduce demand for fossil fuels and the supply at the same time, and that will stabilise the prices. And then Rule 3 is carbon removal, which is much more straightforward. This diagram here is incredibly important to understand the whole approach. It may be a bit mystifying at first, but this is the price signal to be created with the carbon currency. Now, earlier on, I said the reward is an exchange rate, okay? And this example is the XEC US dollar currency pair. So, it's the reserve currency, so it makes sense to look at this pair. And how do we set this price, or why do we set this price as such? Well, there's a very specific reason. In this policy, we're setting the reward price into the future so that we will achieve enough carbon removal that's needed, the minimum amount for a safe carbon balance. So this is actually an estimate of that. Remember the diagram I showed earlier, the 1.5 degree trajectory? To fund that amount of carbon removal, this is the price that we'll probably need, roughly speaking. And so we estimate it into the future and then announce it to the global marketplace and say, this is the price that we're defending. It's called the floor price. So once we announce this floor price into the future, and we back it with central banks, which I'll explain, then what it means is that this carbon currency is not just a regular asset, it's actually a low risk investment, because if you buy the carbon currency here, it's going to appreciate in value over the long term, isn't it? This is maybe 50 years, or that's 40 years from there to there. The actual value is called the spot price, and the spot price is the actual price in the marketplace as a function of supply and demand. But the point is, if the spot price falls below the black, which is the floor, central banks will then step in to make sure the exchange rate goes back up again. And that's the whole point. It's called a public finance guarantee, calibrated for the minimum amount of carbon removal we will need. And that way it's fully funded globally. If we don't have something like this, it's pretty hard to get countries to agree for paying for it, because it'll cost like $1 trillion a year, roughly. And the advantage is that nobody actually pays for it, ironically. We could talk about that later. Now, with this asset that's backed by central banks with this public finance guarantee, just very roughly, this is what might happen. This is just a hypothetical scenario with assumed values, but over a period of 100 years, roughly, there might be a need to issue and trade around 320 or 30 trillion worth of carbon currency. So as an assumed scenario, it's quite possible the private sector might buy up 256 trillion, roughly speaking, of the carbon currency, and then the central banks have to buy the rest. That's the purple line. So that's just a assumed scenario of what it would look like. Just watching the time, we're pretty good. Energy asset exchanges. I just wanted to elaborate on this a bit more because it's so important. This is the example from the Congo or the Amazon. Like in the Congo, there are peat forests with a lot of carbon. And if you go into these forests and degrade them, you know, for whatever reason, whether it's mining or farming or legal logging or whatever, you're actually destabilizing that carbon. But the countries, these developing countries, they need, or they want hard currency profits and revenue so they can develop. So they're kind of caught in a conundrum, aren't they, between development and preservation. So what we can do is come in, buy out those leases. The amount of money we'd offer in carbon currency would be enough to pay for the unrealized profits. We can lock those oil and gas leases in the ground. And then there's a contract they need to sign where it obliges them to take most of that carbon currency and build out clean energy infrastructure. So it's really an energy asset exchange. We're swapping out fossil fuels for renewables. Also, we could prescribe that they have to provide decentralized energy or utility scale energy and other co-benefits. So it can be quite creative. Looking at the building sector, because people here are, I think, architects and concerned about urban design, buildings are actually very difficult to decarbonize because of their fragmented sector of the economy. A lot of different owners and so on. It's complex, as well as the logistics are complex. So in this policy, we could reward the aggregators, sort of like companies that do all the work at the small scale and aggregate buildings together so that they can be paid on a wholesale price, carbon currency, and then they can pass on some of those profits at a retail price to building owners, using technologies that you probably would expect, like insulation, heat pumps, and so on. Carbon removal, this is pretty straightforward, but the point here is that we're going to overshoot a safe carbon balance, so we're going to have to take it out of the atmosphere. The problem being is that the technologies we have today are very new and probably not so scalable. My perspective and advice on this is that we need this long-term price signal that I had shown you, because that will attract huge amounts of money into research and development. Only through that way can we actually lower the cost and provide the new technologies for carbon removal. So if you're interested in this, come and talk to me. But I just want to move more quickly because I've already spoken for half an hour and I wanted to get to some of the theories. So the policy also offers rewards for co-benefits. I won't talk about that here and now because it's getting too detailed. And I'll just summarize why are carbon rewards so useful. They'll reduce reliance on offsetting and greenwashing. It can finance strategic mitigation at speed and scale. It will fully fund carbon removal. It'll establish long-term prices via the central bank backing, and it will improve cooperation through carrot and stick pricing. Expanded theory. So this is the part of the presentation I thought I'd throw in that I haven't really discussed in other presentations because it's a little bit more sophisticated. But if you think about the market failure, there are different avenues for kind of giving advice on what to do. There's the normative and the positive. Universities are supposed to focus on the positive arguments, you know, the theory, the scientific theory, but a lot of people get pulled into normative arguments. So on the left, some well-known normative arguments come from people like Greta Thunberg, the Pope, what to do. And then we have other people saying collapse is inevitable and we're all going to die, that type of conversation. Does that help? Well, maybe it does, but what I've been looking into is a positive argument that can take these ideas in economics and reconfigure it to try and solve this problem systemically. Okay, so you might recognize some of these people. Pigou, who invented the notion of externalities. Degrowth is a concept that's gaining popularity. Planetary boundaries, the Paris Agreement, capitalism, socialism, steady state, and so on. So this is the mission scenario, which I've already presented. I just wanted you to, just to remind you that we do need that carbon removal. And in response to the climate problem, there's this climate policy landscape. So we need to be cognizant of the notion that there are policies from governments and there are policies from non-state actors. You're probably familiar with many of these, so I won't go through them all with you. However, in the middle are these market policies, which are from governments, and there's also non-market policies of voluntary offsetting and voluntary carbon taxes and so on. So the work I've been doing is looking at carbon markets because this is where the most powerful policies can be created. And the research I've done is to reanalyze carbon pricing from the most fundamental level. So this is my product of my work. I call this the carbon pricing matrix. And all it is 2 rows and 2 columns, right? So these are sticks, these are carrots, negative pricing, positive pricing, and the columns refer to the unit of account. So you can have units of fiat money, like euros, or create a new instrument based on carbon units. Now, if you do the analysis, what you end up with is the Pigouvian tax, the Pigouvian subsidy, cap and trade, which refers to Ronald Coase's theory of Coasean bargaining. And but the point I make is that there's a policy missing, and this is the carbon reward. Okay, and the carbon reward, which is the policy I just presented, is actually a form of mitigate and trade. So you've got cap and trade, like the European Union emissions trading scheme, and this is mitigate and trade. It's the world's first proposal for a mitigate and trade, technically speaking. So in this new theory, I had to deal with some difficult questions, like externalities, right? Because you got Arthur Pigou's positive and negative externalities, which are the main theory for environmental economics and resources, true? So what I argue is that, in fact, this market failure is different. My claim is that there's another type of externality that's been overlooked, and I call it a systemic externality. So why? Well, because the positive and negative externalities from Pigou, what they're referring to are impacts from people on other people, typically negative ones, and they're quantified in terms of economic welfare loss, as in terms of dollars. That's how they come up with social cost of carbon at whatever, $40 a tonne or whatever. That's that. That's the quantification of Arthur Pigou's negative externality, true? And what I claim is that in this market failure, there are very strong network effects and economic and political frictions that are overlooked that make this market failure much harder to correct. And it's related also to the way that purchasing power of money is a function of energy, and that energy that we use is strongly coupled to carbon. And for all of these reasons, we can't simply decarbonise this or correct this market failure with a carbon tax. Thus, that floor price I've shown you before for the minimum amount of safe carbon removal, that's this blue line, and technically I call it the risk cost of carbon. So it's the cost of managing the systemic risks associated with the carbon balance. I know that's a lot of theory and a lot of words, but that's why it's difficult. If it were easy, someone may have figured this out previously. So I'm going to just articulate the theory, the hypothesis, just to make it more clear. What I'm saying is we're missing this systemic externality. It's kind of like a hidden cost. It's posited that Arthur Pigou's theory for externalized costs is insufficient for describing the market failure in carbon because his theory does not specifically account for the network effects of incumbent energy systems or the socio-economic frictions that resist decarbonisation. So these network effects are collectively a systemic risk to the climate biosphere and economy. It is claimed that the cost of managing this risk is an institutional cost, okay, not a social cost. So it's called a systemic externality. Furthermore, Pigou's theory does not account for the coupling between money's purchasing power and energy, and more generally between carbon and energy. Critically, his theory does not account for the large energy requirement of carbon removal. Okay, that's important because it's not going to be profitable. You can't produce stuff and sell it because it's too expensive. Finally, Pigou's tax does not invite the intense cooperation that is needed to decarbonise the world economy at a rapid pace. So that's the theory behind it. So how to correct it? With carrots and sticks. So the claim is that we need the reward as a major carrot to fund the decarbonisation quickly and in an orderly way. So it will also, in theory, it will improve cooperation top down and bottom up when you have more money circulating for mitigation, debt-free. Okay, I'm aware of the time, but if everyone's okay, shall I continue with this last section? This is kind of like the philosophical part of the presentation, so I thought you might find it interesting. I hope you do. So the question put forward earlier was, how do you price nature? Well, I argue pricing nature requires pricing the carbon cycle. Okay, so this is the slide I had shown you already at the beginning with these questions, can we price nature? And difficult question. A good place to start is to think about steady state economy, okay? Because this is quite popular amongst certain people. It's a simple diagram suggesting that for us to survive on the planet, we'd need to balance our consumption with recycling, because the economy is a subsystem of the ecosystem. Okay, that's ecological economics. And what I claim is that that model has some truth to it, but it's not sophisticated enough for carbon. And the reason is that carbon has very particular physical and chemical properties, both at the molecular level and for whole living systems, which are complex. And if you look closely at the carbon cycle of nature, nature specializes as self-organizing systems. So the way nature works is that you have specialized cells called chloroplasts that are doing photosynthesis and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And then you have other specialized cells that respire. And this is certainly the case for complex life in an oxygenated environment. Okay, so this is the chemistry or metabolism for complex life in an oxygenated environment, right? True? And that's it. So solar energy comes in from the right, sugars are produced, and it feeds the rest of the system. The point about the padlock is that I'm just simply saying that at a molecular level, these cells and organisms cannot reverse their metabolism. It's just a function of the physics and ultimately the thermodynamics. So the model that I'm putting forward, which is more sophisticated than steady state, is this. This is really about dynamic equilibrium between two systems. So I'm saying that to solve this problem, we actually need two economies or parallel economies as two subsystems of the biosphere. So on the left, we have just the conventional economy, the mainstream consumptive economy based on fiat money, which is debt-based mostly at this point in history anyway, and then the new mitigative economy with our carbon currency, and that'll be a debt-free currency that's not a medium of exchange. And these are the energy flows in this new architecture. So mixed energy comes from the left, that's a combination of fossil fuels and renewables. Carbon rewards transfer resources to the new parallel economy, which also takes in renewable energy to remove carbon from the atmosphere. So that's a system diagram, and now I'm going to wrap up with this question: can we price nature? Okay, so this is a new concept. It's a new philosophy, which I think makes sense. You might have your own opinion, but let's see how we go. So, can we price nature? Well, in the consumptive economy, what we do with money is that it's an explicit social value, right? Because money in your pocket, it tells you what you can buy, goods and services. It's about human beings. What we don't necessarily appreciate is that there's an implicit ecosystem service underneath this that was being mentioned at the very beginning by Willem. And it's not made explicit, but we know it's there, because if we didn't have the biosphere and evolution, we wouldn't be here. We depend on these ecosystem services. So what I claim is that this problem, or philosophical problem, can be resolved, but we have to acknowledge that it can't be resolved with one type of money. We would need another type of money with a different unit of account that gives a new context where it explicitly values ecosystem services at global level. Why? Because implicitly, if we don't do that, our civilization won't necessarily survive, because systems can break down. So this is the context. It's really saying that to resolve the problem, we need to be cognizant of explicit and implicit value with complementary units of account. And so on the left, we have the notion of social efficiency with money, right? Makes sense, because an efficient economy is probably better than an inefficient one, but we need to balance that with systemic safety, which can be inefficient. And this is more difficult to understand, that to resolve Jevons paradox, for example, this mitigative economy will have this arrangement of explicit and implicit values, and it will introduce inefficiencies that are regenerative. And so, thank you. That's the presentation.